I'll never forget that moment when I walked into the Oakdale Crematory for my first night shift alone. We'd been short-staffed for weeks, and I was the only one who'd volunteered to cover the evening shift. I'd worked at Oakdale for over 2 years, but I'd never been assigned to the graveyard crew before. The others preferred to work daylight hours, when the stench of formaldehyde and disinfectant was milder. I'd always found it easier to cope with the smell when I was surrounded by coworkers, but tonight it was like a punch to the stomach. As I clocked in, the supervisor, Ed, handed me the keys and patted me on the back. "You'll be fine, kid," he said, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "Just make sure to lock everything up tight and head out by 6 a.m. The dim fluorescent lights overhead seemed to sway as I walked through the quiet corridors, the silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of screams and chatter that usually filled the halls. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, and I made my way to the furnace room, where I began to prepare for the night's burnings. I'd worked the crematory 1,000 times before, but something about being alone tonight felt different. The hiss of steam and the gentle rumble of the furnace lulled me into a state of autopilot, and before I knew it, I was mechanically following the familiar routine. I checked the schedules, prepped the next batch of urns, and fired up the furnace. As I stood there, the flames roaring to life, the silence outside seemed to thicken, like a fog rolling in from the nearby marsh. It was then that I noticed it. The lights above the furnace flickered, a soft, irregular pulse that seemed almost rhythmic. 37 times, to be exact. Each beat a tiny tremor in the otherwise smooth hum of the machinery. I dismissed it as a loose wire or a wonky bulb, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. When I glanced up, the flickering lights seemed to blur into a maddening pattern of light and shadow. I blinked, wondering if I was just tired, but the effect didn't go away. It was like being the only person in a room full of people, with the air thickening with an unseen presence. The burnings continued, and I went through the motions, my mind a maze of competing thoughts. The flickering lights, my own exhaustion, the growing sense of unease that seemed to seep into the very bones of the crematory. It was as if something was watching me from the shadows, something that didn't much care for the stench of death and smoke. When the scheduled run of urns finished, I was exhausted but relieved. Just as I was about to log off and call it a night, I noticed something that made my heart freeze. A log sheet on the counter, with a single entry on it. _burn #23_. Nothing out of the ordinary, I thought, but then I realized that _burn #23_ was the actual ID for the night's schedule. I'd seen the list myself an hour ago, with 25 urns listed. Where had number 23 come from? The lights above the furnace flickered once, twice, 37 times, as I stood there in stunned confusion. I forced myself to check the rest of the cremation records, my mind reeling, but there was nothing to suggest that the mysterious urn had ever existed. And when I looked up at the logbook, the single entry was gone, replaced by a neat, blank sheet of paper. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine, and I knew right then that I had to leave, to get as far away from Oakdale and its flickering lights as possible. The darkness closing in was suffocating, like being buried alive. I didn't dare look back, just turned my back on the crematory and made a beeline for the parking lot, the only noise the soft crunch of gravel beneath my feet. As I slid into my car, I felt the weight of that question. What was burn number 23?